So who wants to share something they think leaders can do ahead of time, something that the church could do ahead of time that could really impact prevention in the scenario? Someone start us off. What? 2 adults at all time. Okay, when we understand that about 80% of child sexual abuse occurs in a one adult, one child situation, isolation is a key issue for prevention. So just having a look, it's super easy. Just make sure we have 2 adults, and that really helps. This situation is super easy to solve. All Tony has to do, first of all, and that's where the greatest responsibility lies, is with the person holding power, right? For Tony to say, Erica, what? Wait right here. I've got to go get this book for you or whatever. I think you would benefit from it. If your mom gets here, just hold on a second. I'll be right back. Super easy. The other volunteers who were there to say, hey, Tony, remember? 2 adults. What are you doing? So he doesn't even leave with Erica, right? So having a policy that has a boundary that says, an expectation that says, hey, unless it's your own kid, don't go off, especially to an isolated area, with a minor. Easy. So that really does help in prevention. Having a clear expectation. Okay, what else? Yeah.
It's great to have a policy, but also the policy needs to be communicated to the people that it's designed to protect and the people that will affect.
So the policy is one thing, but you're getting at something further, which is who knows the policy and who's empowered to uphold the policy. That's an important point. Now, because I made up this scenario, I know in this scenario, this young mom doesn't serve in the nursery or work with the Sunday school or volunteer with the students. In most churches, does she even know what the policy of the church is? In most churches, no. In most churches, does she have training to give her awareness or empowerment? No, not in most churches. And so those are core leadership issues. Who knows, and by the way, now it's not written in the scenario that Tony is a bad actor, that he's trying to abuse Erica. We don't know that. But I will tell you, bad actors, what they are very often trying to do is test boundaries like this to try to take it further and see, is anyone going to stop me if I isolate this kid, if I break the rule, if I test it? That's very often what they're trying to do. And I will tell you, most of that boundary testing occurs in more unstructured times, before and after the ministry, the formal ministry is happening, and in more informal settings like somewhere else off the church or in a home or somewhere like that. And that means, as leaders, if we're going to do true prevention, we have a challenge ahead of us. And the challenge is, we have to have, yes, a policy for structured ministry. Of course we do. But we also need to bring some education and awareness to the whole community, because that really raises the safety level in the hallways and in the parking lot and in the small group meeting and after the small group meeting at the home and wherever we are as a church community. And when we give that empowerment and education and clarity about expectations and boundaries, that helps give empowerment. Is it likely that a mom with very little power overall in the structure of the church, in most churches, is going to feel comfortable calling out a very charismatic, popular pastor? Most of us understand that would take a unique type of person very often, and many people are just not going to do that. And so we have to give thought to those issues of who gets training, who gets empowerment, who gets clarity of the expectations. Because I don't think those are controversial issues. Like, I don't think we're saying anything controversial to say education matters, training matters, knowing what the policy, first of all, what it is, that it's a good policy, but that everyone knows what it is, that really matters. And that we give empowerment to anyone, that a pastor, like when I was a pastor, if I stand up and say, hey, our policy is for all of us, including me. Even though I'm a leader, I am subject to this policy. And all of us have a responsibility as a Christian community. All of us contribute to this place being a place of safety and respect. Our policy is how we've articulated how we're going to live that out. That we're going to not take vulnerable kids to isolated areas. That we're going to have respect in touch that looks like this. That we're going to use language and not use sexual jokes and stories around the teenagers and the kids and introduce them to sexualized content. Those boundaries are something that all of us are a part of in our community. You know, that type of mentality and leadership really matters. So does it make sense to you that I would say that doesn't seem controversial to me? I hope you agree. I'm sure you do. But here's my next point though. Do those dynamics just automatically happen without us doing something about it as leaders? No, they don't happen. We have to think carefully about training and how we approach that. Our policy, and your policy team is of course working on that right now. But then the additional layership, the layer above that though for leaders is who gets empowerment and an understanding of what our policy is. And I will tell you, in most churches, even if there's a good policy on paper about, hey, this touch is okay, this is not okay. Isolation like this, not okay. Even when that's really good in the policy, most churches don't have a clear mechanism for people to know what to do if they see that being violated. They don't know, oh, go talk to Lindsay, go talk to Bobby, go talk to someone. Actually, they're giving empowerment and clear direction of what to do. Does that make sense? So that's, again, a leadership issue. That's on us. Did you have a comment? Yeah, or question?
I think it's also important that people know, have a clear understanding of who leadership is.
Yeah.
That they feel that there is leadership that's accessible, and then they feel that they can speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to repeat for the recording because it's a very good point. That leadership is accessible, that they know who it is and who they can speak to. And I would say Lindsay did a good example of that earlier when she told you guys, hey, here's our policy team. But if you guys in policy have, hey, it's these 4 or 5 people that we really want, like a team or just any leader, however you guys figure that out to point people to, just every couple months in the service to say, hey, we've got 3 of our, whether it's safety team or deacons or leaders here. Can we just say, hey, remember, if you have a question about our policy or if you have a concern, or if a policy is being violated, these are the people you can talk to, and here they are. It's this person and this person and this person. Just making that very clear, something most churches should and can do. All right, so it's culture, ultimately, that makes a difference. There's a large church. I read a news story about some horrific abuse in their church in another state. The details don't matter. But the article made it clear they had a policy in place. They had cameras. Like, this church had a ton of resources. It was a big church. But a male volunteer was taking kids, and it's not only unstructured times that we need to be worried about. In this case, it was a structured time of kids ministry. A male volunteer was taking young boys down the hallway to the bathroom. Now, I have never read this church's policy, but I almost guarantee you the church's insurance and lawyers, their legal counsel, made them have a policy. I can already tell you, I'm sure, because I read so many policies, I know what the policy likely said. Like most church policies in this day and age, it probably said, when you take a kid to the bathroom, do you go in the bathroom with them? You do not. So I'm sure that was likely all good on paper. And they had cameras and they had a policy, almost certainly. But what they didn't have was that added layer of, hey, what we said on paper, are we doing that? Are we living that? Are we giving empowerment to people to carry it out? Are we as leaders checking up on things to know, is this happening? Is there accountability for what's on paper, essentially? And that's where it really comes back to this issue of culture and leadership. All right, here is the long-awaited framework. Yep, Bobby, you can go. These are the 4 critical areas to furthering that type of culture. These are the things that we've seen make a real difference in a church community that we can work on as leaders. So the rest of the training is going to be walking through these 4 core areas. The first is, if we're going to have a strong culture of protection, it starts with grounding it in our Christian faith. If we tell our people, hey, you all got to sign off on this policy because our insurance company is making us do it. Please have insurance, by the way. I'm not against insurance. If you're in insurance, God bless you. But at the end of the day, what has to drive this, in our opinion, is a connection to our faith, our being a disciple, being a Christian, and walking with God in truth, in love of neighbor. So that really matters. And it doesn't just matter, you guys already get that. But what we need to do as leaders is make sure our whole community gets that. That's the difference. That's what we're after. So we're going to talk about that in more depth. The second area is education. We have to raise the education level of our church community. Excuse me. In most churches, we train staff or volunteers if we're doing really well compared to other churches. But the whole goal of part of this process with us is we're going to do a congregation-based training event that's going to really draw everyone in to say, this is a community issue, not just a staff issue at a church. And we all need some education and practical tools so we can all contribute to the safety of our church environment. It takes all of us because abuse ultimately is a community issue. And so we have to do things with safety talks with children and teenagers. We have resources, and we're going to be working with you guys on that as well. That's a key part of it. So broadening education with adults and even with students and elementary age kids in appropriate ways that are appropriate to their age. Boundaries, we do have to have some specific rules for the structured ministries. Absolutely, amen. At the same time, we need a few key rules for the whole community. That really helps with prevention. So we're going to come back to that issue. And what I mentioned, we need a clear mechanism so that anybody knows what to do if they see a concern. And then that sets the table for the last area, which is accountability. We have to have clear avenues for accountability. And sometimes the accountability it's not abuse, it's just, hey, our policy is being violated. But when that's happening, as leaders, the approach can't be, oh, well, I'm sure they didn't mean anything by it. Now, some people don't mean anything by it. They're just immature. They're not an abuser. But abusers, as I mentioned, will test those boundaries. And that's why as leaders, we have to reinforce and reassert those boundaries when they're being crossed or violated. That sends a strong message to someone who is a bad actor. No, it is not going further. The boundary's here, the boundary's staying here, and we're going to insist that you're accountable. That sends a strong deterrent to those who are bad actors. And then when there are allegations of abuse, we need, of course, a strong protocol, and we'll work on some of that today. As leaders, it's important that as leaders we know how to attend to the most important areas when there is an allegation. All right. Let's just talk a little bit about this first area, connecting this to our Christian faith. And under this heading, there's 3 areas we're going to talk about. So the first is connecting this to God's heart. God speaks to these issues in the Bible very profoundly. So I'm going to give you some ways as leaders to understand that and think about that. So I'm not just going to list all the verses for you. That's not very helpful. But I'm going to give you major categories and ways the Bible addresses this that you can continue to use as you teach and lead and preach and pray and do all the things you're called to do as leaders. So, and for some of you, this will make perfect sense. This will not be a surprise to you. For others, I hope this will push you and challenge you, with how thoroughly the Bible addresses this. And by the way, we've already seen plenty of verses already, right, from Jesus' own teaching. Okay, but here's a category. The Bible speaks often about God's heart for those who are vulnerable, people who are vulnerable. Now, who are some of those people, categories in the Bible? Like, just call them out. What are they? The orphans, widows, the poor, those who have a disability or are sick or afflicted in some way. Yeah, there's just common categories of vulnerable people that are literally mentioned hundreds of times in the Bible. And it's connected to God's own character, who God is fundamentally, like in the Psalms, that God is a father of the fatherless, a protector of widows. That's who God is. It's talking about his fundamental character. Now, the Psalms we know are given to shape our worship and spirituality, our prayers. And the whole point of it is that this idea of who God is shaping who we are, right? As his image bearers. That we are called to be places of refuge for the vulnerable, care for the vulnerable, advocating for the vulnerable, giving justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and destitute, Psalm 82. Rescue the weak and needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. So leaders, we can use the Bible. You can go, Bobby, to the next one. Yeah. So as leaders, we can use the Bible to speak with conviction about the dignity and value of all people and stand against all forms of abuse. I will never forget, yeah, you can go to the next one, Bobby. One of my very first trainings about 14 years ago in a church, in a break, a woman came up to me, and I would guess she was in her 80s, and she said, Mike, I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. And she said, I have been in church all of my life. And she said, I have never heard a pastor talk this way about God's heart for the abused, about God's heart for the vulnerable, that God speaks against abuse in the Bible. And she said to me, when you just walked through those verses, it made a huge impact on me. And she said, when you said God stands with you, she said, my heart soared. I'll never forget that conversation. Now, it's about 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men suffer child sexual abuse. Those people are in our chairs and pews every single week. My church in Lynchburg, your church here. That's about who is in our churches. They need to hear that. So it is about prevention. It is about response when there's an acute situation. But it's also about caring for the people who are already here. And their abuse didn't happen, for most of them, their abuse happened somewhere else or in their home or somewhere else. But they're here. And they need to hear that. That really matters. The Bible, of course, begins in Genesis 1 by talking about that we are created by God in his own image, male and female, right? And that the idea behind that is that we are created with inherent dignity and worth. And that's a major theme of scriptures, that we love our neighbor and treat our neighbors well. That matters. And then Jesus vocally named and confronted abuse. So, of course, you'll remember the famous passage about the millstone, where Jesus promises harsh judgment about anyone who would hurt children. Of course, a millstone was a very heavy stone, right, used to press olives for oil or grind grain. I will tell you, some careful New Testament scholars have pointed out something I think is very profound in this context. In this context, Jesus uses that imagery. If your eye causes you to sin, do what? Gouge it out. If your hand causes you to sin, do what? Cut it off. The scholars point out most often in the day of Jesus, those images related to sexuality. It was the eye of lust. That's the eye, just not just any eye. The eye of lust is what Jesus is probably talking about. The hand that touches someone sexually is probably what he's talking about. So when he talks about harming children and brings that up in the context, and by the way, when Jesus brought that language up earlier in Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, what was he talking about? He was talking about sexuality. So there's just a strong contextual argument that a primary form of harm Jesus has in mind when he brings up children here is the sexual exploitation of children, which was rampant and common in the day of Jesus, just as it is all too common still today. Another passage where Jesus very directly, very strongly condemns abuse is in Mark 12. And here's a question. So he says, beware of the scribes who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. What kind of abuse would you call this? With our kind of modern categories, what is he speaking about? There's lots of good answers here, by the way. What would you call it? Elder abuse. In the day of Jesus, not all widows, just like today, not all widows are elderly, but the majority were, yeah. Elder abuse, that's a good one. What else? Specifically, we call this a kind of financial abuse, right? Because it's property that's being exploited, stolen. What else? Who's doing it? The spiritual leaders who pray and lead in prayer and who have access and trust and power in the lives of these and other people. So in our modern categories, we'd call this a kind of clergy or pastor abuse, right? And then I would argue it's spiritual abuse. Just like we saw in the scenario, so this is financial exploitation. But what are the methods and tools being weaponized to do it? Spiritual authority, a position of spiritual power and trust. And that's being weaponized because otherwise, how would they get access to know who has property, who has vulnerability? So yeah, just in the last passage and this one, we have Jesus very directly, and by the way, here, just as in Matthew 18, there's the strongest possible words of condemnation, right? Some of the strongest words of condemnation and judgment Jesus ever spoke. Well, that's not an accident, right? Because this is devastating, this type of exploitation, abuse of power. But if you take Matthew 18 with the children in this passage, you likely have Jesus very directly condemning what? Child abuse, likely child sexual abuse specifically, elder abuse, financial abuse, spiritual abuse, clergy abuse. Jesus spoke very directly to these issues, very strongly. He didn't mince words. And then in the Psalms and Proverbs, there's all sorts of, and our goal today, we're not going to get into the details of the nuance of intimate partner violence or domestic violence. But when that is connected to a church, yours or mine, often what's happening behind closed doors, again, is very carefully hidden. And when that family comes to church, no one thinks that would be happening behind closed doors, of course. But make no mistake, that type of interpersonal violence is, again, called out in the Bible that there is a path that we are called to walk in as Christians. And the very opposite of that path is interpersonal violence. Just again and again in the Psalms and the Proverbs that is pointed out. Okay, last thing in this section. So here's what I would tell you. I would say for you practically as leaders, think about how you already communicate regarding any priority or any value. You already do this all the time. You make it clear, here's who we are. This is what we're about. These are our values. This is why we're here as a church. This fits in with our Christianity and our faith. So what I would say is, think about what are the avenues for teaching and communication you're already using. And some of that's here in person with classes and sermons and prayers. And some of it's emails and your website and all sorts of other ways you communicate about who you are. So I'm not asking you to invent all sorts of new things. No, just make sure you're doing a good job of integrating your heart for this and God's heart for this in the communication and teaching you're already doing. So just think about how to further that. And the key I would say to you practically is frame it most often positively. Now, there's a time for statistics or a story that's a hard story. There's a time and a place for that. But most often to frame it positively. God cares about each one of you. And we as your leaders care about each one of you. And God calls us to be a place of safety and respect for all, but certainly the vulnerable. That is, the vulnerable are less likely to, or more likely to be, more easily harmed or exploited. So to make that connection, to frame it positively, to connect it to our Christian faith, that is powerful. And we can continue to grow in our ability to do that. That's going to really help us take this forward. All right, let's take a break. Let's do a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about how to connect it to our church mission and values a little bit more. All right, see you in 10 minutes.